In this video we'll be installing the MVX product, so this is the MultiValue experience product, and we are going to go through some steps to finally be able to test the installation. But first we're going to be talking about the Rocket Business Connect site, how we can self-register against that site. Then we're going to talk about some of those minimum database requirements, because we're going to be switching on a component on the database side and able to pull in diagnostics into the MVX server. Then we're going to be installing MVX on Linux. Then we're briefly going to set up a new user and testing the installation to see if everything is working okay. The MVX server registration is highly dependent upon your RBC details, so we need to make sure they're correct. Here we are with the browser window looking at the RBC site here at the login screen, and you'll notice that you're required to have an RBC ID and a password. If you don't have an RBC ID, you would need to be contacting the RBC team at the contact details down here below, so rbc@rocketsoftware.com. If you have simply forgotten your ID, there is an option for some self-help here. You click on that, you're required to put in your email address and they will send your current ID to you. And if you, likewise, if you want to change your password or you've forgotten it, you can simply click on these self-help options here. Once that's all done, you should be able to simply submit and log in, and you'll be presented with some options and stuff like that. In terms of MVX, if you have ordered an MVX license, you will have some certain details on this license. And here we are with an 8-digit MVX serial number. What's really important about this is obviously the number itself, because you need that for the registration, but you also need to know what version of the MultiValue experiences product you have. The platform is less important, it's not used for the actual registration, but your user is. So this is the owner of the actual serial number. So for instance, if your colleague has ordered an MVX product for you, make sure that it's actually the end user, or you are the actual owner of the license, so there's no conflict there. The RBC contacts via the registration is very strict, and you may get some feedback with the RBC details not being correct. So therefore, log into your RBC site first and make sure you got the absolutely correct details for your registration, because if you can't see them in RBC, the MVX server registration can't see them either. So let's have a look at the database aspect of the MVX installation. We need to have a database installed. It needs to be licensed, and although you can use various licensing models, even eval licenses need to be actually licensed. And if we have a quick look here on this Windows box here, I'm bringing up our Universe control panel, and here for starters you can see which version of Universe I'm using in this case. In this case I am using one that meets the minimum requirements, and it's actually currently running. Now if we want to do the same check on a Linux box, we could do the same sort of thing. We can check for the version we're using, and we can check which build number we're currently on. Now we can also check whether the product has actually been licensed, and for that command we can use UE regen -z. We need to run that from the Universe home directory, in fact. There we go, and there we check that the product in fact has been authorized. The same UE regen -z command, you can use that on Windows as well. The next part of it is that we need to make a slight change. In order for Universe to work with MVX, we need to switch on the performance shared memory, and we need to make a change into the UE config. If I bring up Notepad here, this is the UV config from my Windows installation here, and within UV config there is a performance monitoring switch that by default is switched off, but we need to switch that on. And once we have switched on or made this change into UV config, we need to save it, we need to bring universe down, and we need to run the UV regen against database before we restart again, so ensure it's actually running with this component. Now, if you're using the control panel, the universe control panel, you won't actually be able to see that it makes much change inside of the startup, but the universe startup log will make a comment that it has in fact started up in this mode. So that means that, for example, you won't be able to see anything in terms of an extra process or anything like that running, but you will be able to see startup log for universe that the performance shared memory has been created, and that means we're good to go. So the next step is really the MVX installation in itself. So for installing the MVX service, we need to have Docker desktop installed. Now let's install MVX on a Linux environment. In this case, it's actually a Alma 8 virtual machine, but we can check that with the release notes available. And indeed, it appears to be Alma Linux 8. Now, per default, this particular Linux flavor does have the required libraries, which you may have to install on earlier versions like CentOS 7 and so forth. But in this case, if we try to install it, it will probably say, yeah, it's already installed, and that's because it's a part of the default package. What's not part of the default package is that we don't have Docker installed. So we need to install Docker here, and it's fairly straightforward and fairly fast. However, you will see that while we call it Docker, it's actually installing Podman under the covers, but just has some wrappers around it. So we'll install that now, and that's now complete. This means that if we use the Docker command version that we use in our installation scripts to check whether Docker is installed, it comes back clean. I have noticed that on some Linux flavors there may be an additional step there in case there is a symbolic link that's needed. It will mention it in the first line and just create that, and then it'll come back just as clean. But the instructions isn't part of the error message itself. Now we got to this step, we're going to install the MVX server itself, and I have it here already decompressed, and it's the same package as we saw earlier on the Windows environment, except we're going to use the Linux folder here, and there we go. There's the MVX install shell script. We'll accept the license agreement. I am going to use this path rather than under the object directory, just because I've got more space here. So we're going to go ahead with that. I'm actually going to have to change my option 4 because it's not picking up the same details, but I am going to put in that I want my data directory to be under that default folder. There we go. And then I want to ensure that my DNS is correct. In this case, it's coming up with a suggestion. It probably is getting it from the resolve file, one of these here, but it doesn't look correct. So in that case, I'm going to use the NS lookup just to make sure. I'm going to use it against the RBC website, and it's suggesting something slightly different. I'm going to go with the way that this address was resolved, so I'm going to enter that into my menu, because getting this wrong would mean otherwise I wouldn't be able to register the MVX product later on. You can see I've got a couple of DNH search for the domain searches, and I think I'll also enter in the host name, which I'll enter in now, and then I should be ready to go. I press just enter to continue. Now in this case you could see that there was a save file there. It's usually the sort of thing you see during upgrades. In this case I believe I had a previous test installation, and that's why it's a little bit unclean on that. But ahead we go with the actual installation at the moment. Whilst that's running, what you'll notice is that on MVX installations you can always find an installation as a hidden file at root, and this is where it will store all the files. It's also worthwhile perhaps checking how much space there are in the various areas of the file system, but in this case I've got plenty of space under my my home directory, so we should be good. Now one of the issues you may find is that timeout can be a factor. Should the installation mention this, run the MVX status command afterwards to see exactly what the status is. There's always the options to stop and restart it. In this case our MVX installation has completed, so we should be good. Again, if I want to go to the actual installation, and we can see everything is running. The next thing I suggest that we do while we're here is that we install the admin part of the product, the MV Admin, just so you can see that as well. And it has a tar file, and that tar file, this means that we should now have a media file in here, and we need to run the setup script, agree to the license. We could install this next to the server, which I have in the object directory. There should be plenty of space there. I'm going to use my username and so forth so we can get to the actual universe installation via UniObjects, and MVAdmin has been installed successfully. So that completes the Linux install. Now that we had our MVX installed on Linux, let's give it a trial run. We know that MVX was up and running, and we are going to interact with the MVX server via browser window. So we'll get a browser window up and running, and in this browser window we're going to be communicating with the local host, but we're going to use the fully qualified domain name and then communicate on port 9243. As it's the first time we're logging in, we're going to log in with super admin, and it's going to ask us to try to register with our details. So in this case it's my RBC username, RBC password, and then the serial number for which I have, in case it's one that is specific to me, and then try to register the product. This registered fine, there are no errors. If there were errors, we would need to have a look in the logs that are under the server installation directory, and we'd have to find out what sort of errors they are. Usually customers hit issues around breaching the RBC server, and that's why it's so important to get the NS lookup during the installation to make sure you can communicate before that point. Any issues come to support around this initial registration. In any case, we're going to try and register an instance, and in this case I'm going to try and register a local instance that I have here, but also I want to create my own user because I don't want to be using super admin. So at the moment we've only got a super admin account. I'm going to create myself, and here we go. I'll have a choice whether I want to be a viewer admin or super admin. I want to be super admin so I can create other users further down the line. I'm going to insert my primary email address. I'm going to put my RBC details in here because it will be checking against my installation. Create new user and close. And now I wish to log out and log back in with my new user. We're now me, and now I wish to register a database against this installation. In this case it's actually on the local server, so I'm just going to copy the URL here, put that into the host name. This is a Windows box, so let's make it simple here, and in this case it's test, but again make sure that your port 8383 is open, and so forth. And we'll try to register this one. And there we go. It has picked up that we had a University 1135 installation here running. We can view it, and here's the initial impressions of trying to get back data. But this is just the initial, just gearing up everything. I believe this concludes that the installation is complete. I would, however, just show one more thing, which is in case there is a problem reaching the actual MVAdmin part. So what we just saw here with registering an instance is actually a communication between the MVX server and the MVAdmin, and there is a port number on which you can communicate with the MVAdmin. And here, should there have been a problem, could be passwords or whatever, we could have checked whether the connection between the MVAdmin and the database is valid or not. In this case it is, but otherwise that will be another check to do. Okay, I think this completes the initial testing.